Hello anyone who ends up watching this, and welcome to a little rig rundown of a case that I put together to take part in a live show in Berlin during SUPERBOOTH that we called TECHNOISE. This was put on by the New York Modular Synth Society. Many of the people who played are founding members. That was 19Hz Ghost, aka Dissonant, as well as Meta Mytha, and they brought some friends with them. Janky Jams, who's from the Berlin scene, British Airwaves, that was me. Zlob Nicky, who is Zlob Modular. RMM from Chicago, who did some amazing acid, and Caro Aroba, who played for over an hour on a case I think smaller than mine, so that's some live goals for me in the future. This set was something that I wanted to put together in order to be part of the show. This was the first case I've made that I played solo. When I was in New York before, I used to play with a guitarist called Old Men Drunk and Sober. We played a few shows, which was fantastic, but this is the first time that I was playing both by myself and for about half an hour. So it was a big undertaking for me, and this is what I decided to put together. Everything at the show was recorded by me, apart from me, because I managed to forget to press the record button before I started out. So this is just a way for me to try and remember what the rig is, how it sounded for the future, as a little modular diary look back. So this is mainly for my reference only. However, if you're here, you're more than welcome to listen to me ramble about this case for a little while. So the case contains 33 modules. 3 of them are passive, 4 of them are what I would call set and forget, which means that 26 are in some kind of use during the performance. I did a little bit of a look, and I think there's about 63 cables connecting all of them. But it is one that really requires interaction, and I did like this setup because there are a lot of interaction points. In the top row there are 74 knobs, in the bottom row there's 52, and in the 1U row here there's 4. And in the top row there's 35 buttons, there's 63 in the bottom row and 54 in the 1U, and there are 19 sliders and switches in the top row, 7 in the bottom and 4 in the 1U here. So there's a total of 312 interactive elements that you can play with here. So even though it's not the biggest case in the world, I've certainly seen people jam with bigger, there's enough stuff that you can do to maintain interest for a period of time, especially when you're doing something like techno. At least that was the goal. In terms of what we're actually dealing with, we have a small drum section here, which is the Steady State Fate Entity Ultra Kick, which is the biggest kick that I've really heard in modular, and definitely the heaviest one that I own. And I thought that it made perfect sense, seeing as it's a TECHNOISE techno show, to make sure that the kick was going to be a core element. And backing that up are 2 WMD drum voices, the Fracture and the Crucible. The Fracture's a kind of clappy voice that has 2 inputs, so it can kind of play with itself, give itself ghost notes and a little bit of variation. And at the same time you can change it from a very sort of synthetic clap to sounding like you're throwing sticks or something on the floor. So there's a bit of variation you can do throughout a set. Same thing with the Crucible. The Crucible is more of a cymbal. I wanted to get a hat in there because that classic kind of 909 hat for me is a very defining sound of techno, but again I needed something with a bit of flexibility, and the Crucible is able to do something very short and snappy, but then is also able through digital synthesis to do some very weird stuff, like make a cymbal sound like it's a mile wide and an inch thick and all this kind of stuff. So again, by just changing a little bit of that, you can make the percussion sound different throughout the set. Then from a melodic point of view, we have the Bard Quartet by Shakmat and the Griffin's Claws, which is my main melodic piece. I love the Bard Quartet because for me it takes the sample and hold elements and the quantized elements together. It means that anything I put into this will be in some kind of key, because I appreciate a little bit of melody in my techno. I'm somewhere between progressive house and techno whenever I can try to put something together. And I do love the fact that as you turn this dial, you can go through various different note masks, which means as you play, you can move between keys without spending a huge time finding a new nice melodic sequence because you've done it all beforehand, which again, when you're playing live, means that there are some things that you don't want to be messing around with while everyone's staring at you waiting for something cool to happen. So that is a trusted tool. Pretty new tool for me, but a very trusted tool already. And the Griffin's Claws is working in a kind of Turing machine-y way, but with a little bit more safeguards. So I'm able to move this slider, and if you can see up here, it's actually then going into the quantizer. So as I record a slider being slid about, I can either go crazy, or I can very slowly move things up and down, or I can move things to a quantized beat, so I can give myself notes which have a bit more structure to them. But no matter how I play with this, it's always going to sound how I want it in some kind of way, which means that I can make things up on the fly a little bit, but they are within some pretty safe rules that I get to play with. Over into voices, I have a rather drastic bass voice here, which is the WMD Legion as the main voice of it, and 4 of its outputs are going into a switch here, which allows me to change the voice quite quickly from something nice deep and subby and siny through to something a little bit more crazy like the pulse width or the sawtooth with the little windows in it for a lot of timbre to play with. The Zephyr here is feeding into the Legion through the Sync Bassina VCA, which means that if I want to do any cool FM stuff, I am able to play with that and add the Zephyr into the Legion if I want to go a bit more like spiky and atonal. So this voice can pretty much carry part of a set for a while on its own, with a lot of changes and a lot of timbral diversity going from melodic through to atonal. So I needed a bass voice and this kick that was going to be the real foundation of this entire piece. The sub is also summed into the little micro mixer here by IntelliGel, which I'm able to bring in and out again through another slider on the Griffin's Claws, which means that I can decide how heavy I want that to be anytime during the set. And all of it is going into the dark matter because I wanted to make sure I just had lots of grit to play with, because the whole plan about this set was to start kind of nice and get more and more crunchy and more noisy as we went from techno to noise. So even though there's a large amount of figuring it out as we go along, there is some kind of plan to the whole thing. And all of that, to contain it, is going into the low pass VCF by Erica Synths, which is quite a new filter for me, but it's big, it's gnarly, it has a very controllable button right here, and it does have another drive circuit, which means that if I want to chill out on the distortion on this end, I can fire it into the filter for another way of messing up the signal and getting really crazy and crunchy with everything. And all of that is going into a WMD Javelin, which is my favorite performance VCAing and control volume for any voice, really. That's why I have 2 in this case, which means that I can make things feel very small and plucky or long and raunchy and crazy, and then that is influencing the filter as well. So you get that kind of nice feeling of opening up and crunching back down again. Then I have another voice here, which is the Instro Psych, which is going into the Qubit Prism, and this is more my sort of spacey layer to try and get a little bit of progressive feeling into this at some point halfway through the set, make something a little bit more spacey and maybe a little bit more jazzy, because the Psych is a chord module. Normally it likes a lot of volt per octaves in order to make chords, but there is a version where you can put it into a version where it tries to make a chord around one musical input. So that's what I'm using here. I do own a Mutable Instruments Platts, which is, I feel like, the go-to chord generator for this kind of setup, but I did want something different. I also like the fact that this is very saw-based. In fact, I think it's only saw-based, which means that the filter has a lot to play with, and again, when you open that up and fire 4 saws into a filter, you can get some raunch in there as well. So there is a way where this can go from something a bit more floaty and progressive into something more spiky and crazy. And again, that's going into a Javelin. so I can control it. In the any trigger activates the whole envelope mode, means that I can play one note and get this to be very floaty, so I don't need to just keep triggering it. This can be very floaty and nice on top while the bass is going a little bit more crazy, or again vice versa. In terms of effects, I have two here that are dedicated to each voice. I wasn't able to work out how to satisfactorily put effects onto the drums, so the drums are quite dry and minimal in this, and I just rely on being able to change their sound in order to create variation there. I would have loved some kind of delay onto the kick in order to get a kind of rumble thing going on, but I didn't really have enough time to make that work for this. So the mimeophone and the psych are talking to each other. Again, to make that more longer, more spacey, it means I can just play one note and the mimeophone can take it away from there and run with it for a long time. It also means if I'm very slowly moving through any kind of melody, they will start to pile on top of each other to create this feeling of more notes, more sound than there actually is. And the bass has the Desmodus Versio at the end of it. Again, just if I'm going very plucky, I can just add a little bit of tail to that just to help fill the sound, because the kick isn't rumbling quite how I wanted it to fill in the whole lower end. So that's just a little bit of a trick there for this case. The third voice, which isn't quite a voice but it's a sample, is the radio music, and I've put in a few kind of random samples that I enjoy into that, and that's going into the beads. And I like the relationship between these two, because if I put the beads fully dry, you can just hear what's going on with the sample, and I'm triggering that so it just repeats a certain loop to get that feeling of sort of house music. But then as I make the beads wetter and wetter to fully wet, and then just fire a whole bunch of triggers into it, I can turn that voice into another percussive source, so it's going very gated, like and it's just that little variation that gives you that little snatch that you know it's a voice but you can't hear what it's saying, which again can help hold interest and prick your ears up in a way which for me is quite satisfying, and does mean that if you just put that and a kick together for a second while you're figuring everything out, you can chill out but you can still maintain interest. So that's a little bit of a trick which I've been enjoying, and that's on a filter as well if I need to just make sure that that isn't interfering too much with the rest of the sound. And then there's quite a lot of modules in the final output, but again, because this was playing live and I needed it to sound as good as possible, I used a Vortices mixer which has just a really lovely warm sound to it. It has very nice unity out. I do feel like the more I play with it, the more it does seem to glue itself together a little bit itself, so it does sound really nice when it's coming out. That is going into the WMD muscle compressor anyway, just on the safe side. It's not sideshade or anything, and again I would love to have played a little bit more with the idea of sidechaining in this, but I ran out of time and at some point had to commit to a build, otherwise I was just going to be rearranging my case forever and then find out it's showtime and then panic. So no sidechain here. However, the compressor is hearing the kick and is ducking everything just a little bit anyway, so the kick is still coming through, but not through any sidechain or anything clever. It's very much just finding the right ratios and detection here in order to make that feel like it's very quickly pushing things down and then bringing it back up again, this little duck. And then all that is going into an overseer, which is just a useful effect, almost DJ style effect, where you can quickly take the highs or lows out of the track and then pile them back in. If you're trying to think of something to do and you want to create a little bit of space or a little bit of tension, just taking all the lows out for a second and then firing them back in normally does really well for a techno set. It's just surprising how quickly just taking something away and bringing it back can get a little whoop from a crowd, especially in Berlin. Then everything is going into a Shackmat high pass, and again that was just to make sure that I wasn't accidentally creating a whole bunch of sludge which the speakers would kick out. So that's very much just like a little safety module. I try and get in there at all times, especially if it is ever going to be played on a decent system, because half the time you can't tell if you're too sludgy if you're just in headphones or just on home speakers, but if you put it through anything powerful you will know very quickly that you have messed your sound up. So that is my safety output that I've used pretty much all the time. And then the Pro output by WMD here is just making sure that I've got some really nice balance jacks that I can put out into any mixer. It is taking up a lot of space. I would love if there was a way of making that a bit smaller. I know some of the bigger mixers have their own outputs, but again, just the way that I've got this with the vortices, I needed that in order to get out. So it's doing its job. It's a set and forget, but it worked really nicely for the show, so I was happy with it. So quickly, the last thing I haven't talked about is sequencing, and everything is going through the beating heart of this, which is the Constellation by Acid Rain Technology, which is a really interesting sequencer which has a huge amount of power behind it, but is still based off Euclidean rhythms to a point. But you can you set one Euclidean rhythm, but then you can add more and more on top of them, so you start to get some crazy interplay. And the one thing that I liked about this was the fact that you can save a whole bunch of presets, which means that you are able to, again from a live point of view, play with stuff, and then when you need to, you can just go back to something that you have already saved. So if you're playing around and everything starts to go a bit weird, which it did actually in the live show that I did, the load button will save you very quickly. It also has 8 outputs, so for here I'm able to trigger the drum voices really nicely. I would have been able to trigger another drum voice quite easily, but here I just was able to create some separation. So when I was looking at it very quickly, a kind of muscle memory, I knew that there was always a separation between the kick, the claps, and the cymbal, which meant that I wasn't pressing wrong buttons, because the one thing I really wish I'd had more time to do was to really practice with this guy, because it's really powerful, it's really interesting, but at the same time, if it starts to go off the rails, it can be hard to pull it back in, because you only have one way of controlling with the knob here. And even though things like the mutes are really, really important and really great, and the fact that you can change programs and stuff, if you hit the wrong button or you do mix something up, I needed a bit more time to get really, really au fait with that, because there was a point during the show where for some reason I started to put the kick on the 2 and it really messed me up, and I had to do a whole accidental spacey breakdown which definitely went on longer than I meant it to, just so I could try and figure out how to get the kick back on the 1. And that's the kind of thing where when it's dark and when it's loud and you're in real time, you need to try and figure that out pretty quickly. So that was a learning for me, that this needs a lot more practice in order to figure it out. But I think that it being the clock source of this, because I don't have room to put a Pam's New Workout, which I would normally have in any case ever, this was able to do an awful lot for me. Even though it's super large, it's very playable, and it was doing a lot of good stuff, very reliable more often than not. Things that I don't ever need any practice with are the IntelliGel steppies. They are one of the things that got me into Eurorack, because I realized how fun and performable they were, and when I realized that one use existed, the trace lights that just go along the top and then on the bottom made so much sense to me that I realized I could play these in a very rhythmical way, a very intuitive way, which is why I have 3 of these. I could probably do everything I need to do with 2, but having 3 just again in my brain allows me to separate out what is going on and what I'm doing as I play. Each one of these is dedicated to one of the voices. The first one here is the bass, and that is triggering a bass note. It's also triggering when it samples from the quantizer, so it's deciding when it's going to get a new note to play, which does that great modular thing where I'm able to separate my note from my pitch events, which means that I can have a sequence that's playing and then only change when I want it, and I can move and change however many beats I want there when it's playing, how many pulses, which means that I can start to create something with a little bit more structure to it. I can go 4/4, or I can go just 16 blips and mess things up in that way, which again just helps make make any of the loops just feel longer and more interesting. And then there's the output D here is going into the VCA Sync Bacina for the Zephyr, which means that I can choose when I want to just fire a little bit of frequency modulation into the Legion and just get that all spiky and weird. The second steppy is doing exactly the same thing without the FM for the Psych, and then the third one is resetting the radio music and then also triggering the beats. So I think that's everything that this thing does. I'm gonna do a little bit of a play around and make a few more audio notes, and then hopefully this can just turn into something musical and interesting. Here's hoping. So first things first, for techno, here is the beating heart of any techno set, which is the kick drum. The SSF Ultra Kick for me is just a perfect kick drum. It has so many ways that you can mess with it. It can go from something much more like knocky and light, or you can get into some real resonant, longer tail, bassy sounds. Just for the sake of this, I'm going to give it a little bit of a knock. Sounds good enough to me. Accompanying that is a clap. This is very clappy right now. It has a little bit of a reverb on it in order to give it a little bit of space over the top of the kick, but this is a very obvious, predictable, housey techno sound. And then I've got the same thing with the hat. It's just doing a little offbeat tink. If I look at the clock, yeah, we're at 133 BPM, which is what I decided to use. I'm normally a little slower, but techno is definitely pushing the tempo limits right now, so I wanted to do something a little bit more contemporary and maybe just try and push myself out of my comfort zone a little bit, because the quicker the track goes, the faster you've got to be. So this is nice and simple, and again, with the mutes, it's so nice and easy just to choose when you're going to bring things in and out. Removing the kick for a second and then bring it back in is so easy, but somehow so very satisfying to do every so often. This can go into the absolute bare minimum of techno for me, which is just a kick and a hi-hat. And again, as you go into that more crazy stuff with this, you can start to play with the sound of it, you can detune it. Then you can start to really fill in all the space with it and go super crazy with it. You can almost kind of make your own fill by giving it a little bit of a wash there. And there is a choke as well on this, which I like, because it starts to give it a little bit more animation. Even if you're playing with a decay, it almost self-sidechains in a weird way, which again just adds a little bit more interest to it. So as well as that, on these two, which gives you that very predictable, I can dance to this for a while, techno beat, there's two other triggers on these drum machines. There's the tick, which I'm not quite sure exactly what the tick is doing, but it's just another way of triggering the clap. And then there is the center of the cymbal over the edge, and what I've done is I just put a few more events into that just to fill things out. So the second clap is more animated, it's a little bit quieter, but has a little bit more animation to it, but it's just filling that out. Which means that, again, if I want the percussion to do a little bit more, something a bit more ghosty and fill out the space, I can do that with this very easily. And they can work together, where the second one is just beefing up the basic clap. And then same thing with the cymbal, is that I've got a kind of dubbed out post-kick fill with the hi-hats as well with the cymbal. That can help bolster these up. So you can play absolutely everything, and it's quite busy, so there isn't so much for the instruments to play with. However, it does mean that if you've just got a bass, then you can fill things up in another way. Oh yeah, one other thing which is cool about the programs here, programs 1 to 8, this is the example of you being able to set rules that layer up over each other. So this one here, I've just made a 64-step length bar, and then I've got one event and I've rotated it all the way to the end, and that just gives me that da-dump. There it is. So for me, I know where every 4 bars are, but also it's just a nice way of, again, making it not feel like it's completely going on forever and ever and ever as a loop. There's that extra thing that actually turns what essentially is a 1-bar loop into a 4-bar loop. So that was very useful for both me, but I also think it's useful for anyone listening as well, just to feel like there's a little bit of variation in that. And again, if I wanted to play with that myself as well, I can start to just add more and more and really go kind of like crazy and off with my kick drum. It almost sounds a bit more like I'm playing with the grids or something, which is, again, a really fun other module which I consider putting into this. But it does mean that I can pre-program some Euclidean gridziness vibes, and then whenever I need to, I can turn it off again. The pre-programming of this and doing some of that before just gives me a lot of freedom and confidence. And again, if I wanted to, I could play with some of this at the same time, you know, like, and just like during the set, I could decide what. But then doing stuff like that is then when you feel like, oh, maybe I'll give that a try, and then you realise, that's not really working very well. So you got to be careful, and you got to know when you can just mute out and save yourself. I mean, that's almost like a little fill which I could keep there, kind of a little gallop, and then for some reason there's a little pause. No, my pause is gone. Oh no, there it was. So that's when things start to get layered up and you don't quite know exactly why it's doing things. It's a lot of pre-prep is vital. But then I can then go mute and go, nope, that goes away again now. And now I've muted that, and for some reason this is still going crazy. So this is the kind of stuff which I realized, because for some reason, there we go. So that sounds cool, but again, clearly I pressed something which I didn't mean to. Right now I'm back to 4. So clearly I thought I was on one of these and I was on one of these and I was turning things around and not hearing it until I removed it. And I'm pretty sure that's what I did when I was playing live in order to accidentally put the kick on the 2. So that is something which, like I said, the practice is very important with this, and I needed to spend more time with it, because when things do go crazy and you're trying to fix it rather than add to it, that is not satisfying for anyone who's actually looking at what you're doing. So that is a good reminder even now to myself to make sure that that gets fixed. Alright, let's add a bit of sound to this and see how the bass is sounding right now. So I'm just going to play a few of these kind of at random, and the bass sounds like so. Okay, so that's very deep, but sounds cool. It's got a nice pulse to it. That is currently the sine wave. There's no distortion, but yeah, if I add a bit of distortion, you can hear there that it's got a lot more growliness in the bottom there, which is fun, but let's back that off a little bit. If I change the filter just so it has a little bit of a doink to it, maybe. There you go, now it has a very obvious I'm a note, but you can hear that the Desmodus is also just adding in a little bit more at the end as soon as it's finished. If I just do that, you can hear there's that whoosh. And now that's something that I do which I should stop doing, which is press and holding this in order to mute the tracks by just turning the triggers off, because it does mean that when I launch it again, it's off and I don't have any resets. So I then just have to remember that I've done that, because otherwise my bass and my anything else I'm playing will be off. See, because now that's less satisfying. Let's see if I can get it on the right one. Right, that's better. So then, if I move my fader, you can hear that I'm going up my set scale, and I think I've got this right now limited, so I can only go 2 octaves, because that's as high as I'd like a bass to actually want to go. And then if I select a D and then, for example, throw these in here, that I'm able to spike up the bass by adding a little bit of the FM into the lesion itself. That's fun. Alright, I'm just going to record a random sequence here and just see what it gives us. And I can see here that right now I'm triggering every time I can possibly play, I'm resampling this. So if I remove this and say only do it twice, there's a lot more control in that now, because you're waiting for each beat to see whether or not there's a new note coming. See what other, scan through these other. I'll cut the FM for a second to see. Okay, a bit nicer. More bassy there, where it's got a bit more of an overtone there. It feels quite nice. So we could like start here in our breakdown, and we can slowly, over the course of time, we slowly knock that off and dissolve more just into the bass. Make a clear transition that that's where we're living. Get that extra little oomphy there. we can drop our kick back in. We've got a little vibe. Transition with our overseer. We can also change so we keep it on one note while we do our transitions. And then we can hit all three buttons and hopefully go back to a song. Ah, missed him here. And then the more you just play with the buttons, the more you start to mess with your sequence and start to create a bit of variation. Let's play with our voice for a second so we can drop our percussion out a little bit. Right, we'll keep it higher so we're waiting for a drop here.
Let's talk about the jam. 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 Let's talk about the jam.
That is actually from a People's Court episode where they were talking about a door jam, but I like the idea that they were talking about jams. No one's ever going to find that sample. I can filter that in.
Let's talk about the jam. Let's talk about the jam. Let's talk about the jam.
Listen when I turn this up, how it just starts to become more percussive and fun.
Let's talk about the jam. 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 Let's talk about the jam.
So I'm just triggering it, I'm just adding a little bit of variation into the self LFOs in the module so I can make it sound a little bit more voicey.
Let's talk about the jam.
Or I can just make it very clippy. But I quite like having just this little snatched sound, and it just works nicely with the beat. And even if you just take the claps away, you've just got this little random thing at the top which you can play with a little bit. So there's lots of ways you can play with that as well, which is fun. see what our chords are saying. Try and cut it off just as the mimeophone is catching it. This is in a bandpass. The bandpass doesn't really grab much of it on the left-hand side of the twist here, so my favourite thing to do is to just play with this a bit myself, because it throws it into the mimeophone, so you get this undulation the entire time. Let's see if I keep this without grabbing another pitch, see whether or not I can make the bass kind of sing underneath it a bit. nastiness. There's a little punch to it while I play with this. If I fade that down again, if I shorten this. There you go. I'm trying to fill the space here to see how these behave. But then the filter here allows me to really mess with this beyond just filtering it, which is kind of crazy. With a little bit of extra filter, I can get more of that atonal stuff. Now, we're no chord anymore, just weirdness. No idea what that is, but that'll give us something else to listen to. This is always risky. Probably going to wind this up now because it's got got to a point where it's doing its own thing again, and this was just to remind me about the versatility you can get out of a system that maybe at first glance, to me at least, looked like it wasn't going to be able to carry interest for the time it did, but I felt like it was good. I felt like we had a good time, and I want to start expanding on this. There's a few things which clearly I'm not great with yet, and there are some things that definitely... Let's see if we can just get this back into chords quickly, just to see if this... Oh yeah, we can get back in there. Yes, okay, so we can definitely, if we need to, just... And then we can calm our bass down by going always back to sine, I think, probably. Take the drive off. Open it up and let it have its little sort of death cry. Really wonk out the FM for a sec. Always cheap by just playing with the Disbodis and letting that wash out forever. Surgeon.
I'm not sure honestly. 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 I'm not sure honestly.
Surgeon can play us off into the great abyss.
I'm not sure honestly. I'm not sure honestly. I'm not sure that all this information is really useful. And maybe, just maybe, it's more of a distraction. You can learn so much from just figuring it out yourself. I learned the vast majority of what I do that way. I don't believe that there's just one way to do anything. Ultimately, it's much more important to focus on your own method and create your own style and sound.
Well said, Tony. And that'll be this modular diary. Let's see how much of this makes the edit. And let's see what version 2 of the TECHNOISE case looks like in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.